Welcome to Stealing from Wizards Volume 1, Pickpocketing, by R.A. Consul, read by the author. Chapter 9, Avalon Junior High. School started the very next day with an assembly for all students. Kuro had to run to catch up with his classmates, as he'd taken too long struggling with his buttons and tie. They still weren't right, but he didn't want to be late. Being a little late had some benefits. It was the first time Kuro had had a chance to run since his arrest. He laced up his running shoes and let the wind push him along the path, sweeping up a flurry of leaves in his wake. He caught up with the other stragglers and blew past them, his oversized backpack bouncing against him as he ran. He was so engrossed in the exhilaration of moving his legs and breathing fresh air that he hardly noticed the heat of the summer quarter, or someone shouting his name. "Wait up, Kuro!" The frustrated shout pulled him from his reverie. He skidded to a halt, turning to see who had called. Half a dozen Summerhill residents were looking at him with disdain. They apparently did not consider running an appropriate activity for young people. In stark contrast to their perfectly groomed snobbishness, Charlie was loping up the trail, a tangle of clumsy limbs. Her hair looked like a bale of hay. She wore her uniform skirt over her uniform trousers. Her tie was tied in a single overhand knot, and she was positively thrilled with all of it. "You ran right past me and Marie," she accused Kuro as she skidded to a stop beside him. Kuro had clearly done something to earn a reproachful scowl, but wasn't sure what. "I guess I did," he replied. "But we're friends," she asserted as if it were an undeniable truth, "and friends should walk to school together." Kuro didn't quite know how to respond. Were they friends? He didn't really know how friends were made. Maybe a boat ride without any thefts or violence was enough. He did think he liked the strange girl, but he couldn't imagine it being that simple. "Okay," he said slowly. "So do we walk now that we're together?" "No, gosh!" Charlie flung her arms up in exasperation. "We have to wait for Marie. She didn't run to catch you. You're really fast, by the way." Marie approached them slowly up the trail, looking very carefully put together. Her explosion of wiry black curls was tied back in a tight bun. Her clothes were neat, her shoes freshly polished, and she walked with the same unhurried pace as all the other students. Marie stayed quiet as they walked. Kuro guessed that she had been given about as much choice as he had in the befriending of Charlie. She seemed uncomfortable with how loud Charlie was and how much she stood out from the crowd. Kuro liked that Charlie drew attention. She was boisterous and never stopped talking. That meant fewer people were paying attention to him. Kuro also quickly found that he liked her stories. As they walked, she told 3 separate and conflicting tales about the founding of Avalon. She concluded her earnest explanation of how Avalon was a giant sleeping turtle that might wake any day and drown them all, just as they reached the amphitheater, where the assembly was being held. It was a grand limestone basin, deep in the spring quarter, with tiers of stone benches carved into it. The rows of benches radiated out from a broad central stage, where a dozen or so adults milled about, shaking hands. Teachers, Kuro guessed. Charlie pulled them into a set of benches next to Arthur, who was already waiting quietly and became flustered at having people sit near him. Arthur had been in bed with his curtain drawn long before curfew, and was dressed and gone before Kuro awoke. Kuro wasn't sure if the boy was actively avoiding him or just very responsible. His current behavior made Kuro think that Arthur might be trying to avoid everyone. They sat together, but Marie jumped from the stone bench and shouted in surprise. "The bench! It squishes!" she said, pointing at her seat. Her reaction earned a chorus of laughter from the other students around her. "Well, of course it does," answered Charlie. "They wouldn't be very comfortable if they weren't." She bounced a couple of times on her stone seat to illustrate how soft and yielding it was. Marie lowered her head and her voice to try to shake off the attention of the students around them. "But the rocks don't squish. Not where I am from, anyway." "Oh, most don't here either," said Charlie. "These are enchanted." The explanation did little to comfort Marie. She cautiously returned to her seat, but kept shifting as though trying to find a way to make the bench less comfortable and more stone-like. 2 swift claps echoed from the stage, cutting through the chatter and quieting the crowd. Principal McCutcheon stood at the podium at center stage. "Good morning, students," she began, her voice easily filling the large amphitheater. She sounded as though she were speaking from only a couple of yards away. "It is my pleasure to welcome you to this 98th academic year at Avalon Academy." "I thought that you said the school had been here forever," Marie whispered to Charlie, calling her out on her tall tales. "Not the school," Charlie corrected her. "The island. It used to be something else before it was a school." McCutcheon continued her welcome speech in her crisp and precise manner. "For almost 100 years, Avalon has been home to all students of the 4 kingdoms. Everyone is equal at Avalon. Here, the students of every court can come together and forge bonds that will last a lifetime, strengthen the ties between our kingdoms, and become productive citizens of the Confederated Kingdoms." They may all be at the same school, and everyone may wear the same uniform, but who came from where was obvious. The students from Wertheim were universally taller and blonder than everyone else, and all arrived with warm cloaks over their uniform cardigans. The Summerhill kids, while much more varied in size and color than the elves of Wertheim, all wore short sleeves, light vests, and a look of dismissive superiority. The Château du Printemps residents simply looked altogether cleaner and better ironed than the Autumn Lodge lot. They lounged and chatted like lodgers, but somehow managed to look like they were posing for a portrait or waiting to be served while doing it. The lodgers, however, just looked like poor, mismatched leftovers, which is what they were. The students from each residence sat together, hardly mingling with the others. They were all in the same place, wearing the same uniform, but Kuro was no more their equal than he had been on the streets. McCutcheon wrapped up her welcome and then introduced a man they called Principal Thrimson, which confused Kuro, as he didn't know why there needed to be 2 principals. Thrimson looked like a man hewn from stone, his face and hair gray with age, his skin chiseled with wrinkles like crevices. His stony gray eyes seemed to stare into every student at once as he took the podium. "A brief reminder of some rules." His voice was arctic cold, cavernously deep, and his elvish accent made each syllable sound like a threat. The whole audience stiffened as though worried that they had already done something wrong. "No student should be outside the grounds of the residence past sunset without special permission. Familiars are not to be left unattended out of sight of their masters. The Blendlands are entirely out of bounds, and crossing the Vale is extremely ill-advised. Junior students are not allowed on the Avalon Plateau unless escorted by a teacher." Charlie let out an audible sigh of disappointment while Kuro sat relieved but confused. "If we can't go to the plateau, how are we supposed to go to school?" he asked. "There are 2 schools," said Arthur in a quiet and almost mechanical tone. Kuro started. It was the first time Arthur had said anything in his presence. "The junior high is on the ground," Arthur continued, "because junior students can't get on the plateau by themselves." Kuro examined the plateau. It rose like a pillar almost straight up, but the granite walls had cracks and crags that he could grab onto and jump off. He was pretty sure that he could climb it if he tried. Mr. Thrimson was still talking when Kuro turned his attention back to the stage. "Lesser transgressions will be addressed by our vice principals, Mr. Flint and Mademoiselle Lefay." He gestured to 2 heartless-looking figures on the stage to his left. "It is preferable for everyone that no offences warrant the involvement of myself or Principal McCutcheon." Kuro understood why McCutcheon had let Mr. Thrimson deliver the rules. When she spoke, Kuro worried that he was about to be punished. When Mr. Thrimson spoke, he worried that nobody would find his body. When the assembly ended, the older students were quick to head up to the high school. They were not eager to attend class, rather they enjoyed the opportunity to show off to the new students. Each had a different means of getting themselves to the fortress-like school on the towering plateau at the center of the island. A stream of them flew on brooms, carpets, and giant mortars, wooden bowls with iron rims. One rode on a winged horse, another a griffin. Some enchanted their shoes to allow them to walk up as though it were level ground, and Meredith appeared to be climbing it without any magic, just using her brute strength. The younger students cheered at the spectacle as they walked the substantially more level route to their school. The junior high was deep in the spring quarter, not far from the ferry. That meant the lodgers would have the longest walk, having to pass through either summer or winter to get there, making it all but impossible to dress for the weather. As they neared the school, the thick spring forest yielded to a broad lawn. The single-lane pathway of interlocking bricks they had been walking on split and wrapped around a wide marble fountain before leading up to a concrete staircase to the school. The school itself was not as ancient or imposing as the high school on the hill, and not nearly so incredible as Charlie's stories had suggested. It certainly wasn't hewn from the stones of the heart of the earth by the hands of giants. It was instead a tall red brick building with many windows. A large clock was built into a bell tower, which rose above the big wooden doors of the main entrance. The clock's black iron hands indicated how little time they had before class started. At the doors stood Ms. McCutcheon. Kuro wondered how she had beaten them all there without messing up her hair, but there she was, still and fierce as a gargoyle. She was evaluating every student as they passed, her lips pursed and her left eyebrow raised in disapproval as they approached. Kuro tried to hide behind his compatriots, but he did not escape her glare. She cleared her throat as they passed. Kuro winced, expecting punishment from some unknown offense. "Ms. Cook," she said in a voice so sharp that Kuro nearly apologized. "That uniform is entirely unacceptable." "Is it?" asked Charlie, inspecting herself. "It's the trousers, isn't it? I don't like wearing skirts without something underneath." The principal took a deep breath to steady her nerves. "It is not that you are wearing trousers, Ms. Cook. It is that you are wearing both trousers and a skirt. You are required to wear only one or the other, not both. I should say the same for your cardigan and the vest. You are wearing nearly 2 full uniforms." "I don't have to wear the skirt?" Charlie said in astonishment. She practically tore it off and jammed it roughly in her backpack. "Thanks, miss!" Ms. McCutcheon furrowed her brow at the rough treatment of the clothing. "And the state of your ties," she continued. Charlie shrugged. "I don't know how to tie one." "Then perhaps you should ask the assistance of some of your capable peers at the lodge." The principal gestured towards Marie and Arthur with a slight tilt of her head. "In the interest of time, though, I shall demonstrate today. Now hold still." Kuro tried to pay attention to the intricate series of movements needed to create the flat and symmetrical knot as Ms. McCutcheon tied Charlie's and then Kuro's ties. He was distracted, though, by the other students passing by. They all seemed relieved to have escaped the principal's scrutiny. An older girl with a much shorter skirt than the others gave him a small salute and mouthed, "Thank you," as she passed through the school doors. Once finished correcting their uniformity, she ushered the 4 of them through the doors before turning back to interrogate the next students who did not meet her standards. The school was much larger than it appeared on the outside. This was entirely normal for buildings as far as Kuro was concerned. Pretty much all of the buildings behaved that way in Detritus Lane, and he thought nothing of having a class on the 5th floor of a 4-story building. Such architecture might not be as common as he thought, though, as almost all of the other first years stopped dead as they crossed the threshold and found themselves in a foyer almost as big as the building. It took considerable corralling by Ms. McCutcheon to get the group moving and headed in the correct direction of their first class. Elvish. As class began, Kuro quickly realized that he had absolutely no idea how school was done. The teacher, Ms. Friggard, was as elven as can be. Tall, strong, and blonde, with golden tan skin and bright golden eyes. She seemed nice, but dove so quickly into the intricacies of the Elvish alphabet that Kuro was left hopelessly behind. She had already erased 2 chalkboards full of letters and words before Kuro even realized he was supposed to be writing things down. Numerology followed Elvish. The teacher, a Tirnanogian woman called Mrs. Lovelace, was enthusiastic and animated, but appeared to also be completely unhinged. She walked only in straight lines, and pivoted on the spot to turn at very specific angles, which she would frequently stop the class to double-check with a large brass protractor. She wore a vibrant crimson dress with patterns traced all over it in gold. Her clothes matched the decoration of the classroom, such that if she stood too close to the wall, she could easily be mistaken for one of the many tapestries. She had arranged the desks according to a complex set of mathematical rules, resulting in them being scattered inconsistently throughout the room and facing in all different directions. Kuro got stuck with a bad desk and had to sit backwards on his chair for most of the class to see the teacher. Mrs. Lovelace spoke only in sentences with a prime number of syllables. It is the most effective method of recollecting whole concepts as they cannot be easily subdivided, she explained. Whether or not that was true was hard to say, but the way she was constantly counting syllables on her fingers as she spoke was very distracting. Despite Mrs. Lovelace being energetic and encouraging, the subject matter was impenetrable. They spent their first class learning the circumstances under which 1 and 1 could equal 3, and were promised that the next lesson would go on to cover various ways one could add 2 and 2 together. The students left with their heads spinning. Evocations seemed promising in comparison based on how the class started, but quickly proved otherwise. The teacher wasn't in the class when the bell rang. Just as the students began to get curious about his absence, he appeared at the head of the room in a fiery explosion. He paused to pose dramatically as the smoke cleared to reveal his figure. He was a rather small man, thin and balding, with pointed features and a crooked nose. What hair he did have was groomed so that it stood straight out at the sides, and his beard was greased into a fine point, giving his whole head the look of a triangle balanced on end. Perhaps to distract from his unimpressive stature, he dressed flamboyantly, wearing a long black coat with red and gold trimmings and a tall upturned collar. Just before the shock of his entrance began to fade, he began to talk in a deep, resonant voice. "Who among you has the bravery and resolve to master the subtle powers of evocation?" He raised both hands dramatically, as though holding a weighty globe in each. "Who can bend the world with the force of their will?" 2 desks at the front of the room raised off the floor, startling the students sitting at them. "Who has the inner spark to master the elements?" he challenged as he drew an amber rod from his jacket. Lightning danced along its length and arced out over the room in a dazzling cascade of blinding light. "Who has the grit and metal to move mountains?" He pulled a stone from another pocket and slammed it down onto the wooden floor. As he drew his hand up and away, the stone grew into the shape of a great peaked mountain, rising almost to the height of the teacher. "Who can fan the flames of their passions into life?" He thrust his fist upwards and the stone erupted like a volcano, sending a great bird made of fire into the air. It soared around the room, leaving a trail of smoke in its wake. "Who would wade into the tempestuous torrents of the soul?" He dropped his amber rod, reached out towards the back wall, and pulled as if tugging on a long rope with both hands. He pulled forth a river of water shaped like a dragon, which splashed around the room. The water dragon chased down the bird of fire, dousing it and releasing a burst of steam. The dragon then turned and charged violently towards the teacher. "And who dares delve into the icy depths of their psyche?" His voice had grown to a bellow that reverberated around the class. He drew in a deep breath and exhaled a cold mist. The mist froze the steam dragon from nose to tail, leaving a sparkling sculpture of ice. "If you are bold enough, brilliant enough, and brave enough," he stopped abruptly, placed a hand over his heart, then continued in a more subdued tone. "Then I, Stanislav Oganov, will be your guide." He concluded with a flourishing bow. The class couldn't help but applaud the performance. Kuro had never seen anything like it, and he stared in wonder at the wizard, who humbly waved off the praise of the crowd. "If you all work hard, study hard, and practice often," he said encouragingly, "you too can master all of the delicate arts of evocation." What Mr. Oganov had failed to mention in his introduction was the means by which they would master the arts. Over the course of the class, he filled the blackboard a dozen times with runes, equations, and diagrams. Kuro couldn't copy fast enough to catch half of what the teacher wrote, and certainly couldn't listen at the same time. It also turned out that the opening demonstration had been more than a little misleading, as Mr. Oganov later explained that by the end of term they should be able to lift a small rock, boil or freeze a cup of water, turn rose quartz into amethyst, and possibly, if they were extremely diligent, deliver a mildly uncomfortable electric shock. As Kuro piled the 2 new evocation textbooks into his already overweight backpack, Mr. Oganov approached him. "Kuro lad," he said in a casual, friendly manner, "I'm a friend of Talen's. He asked me to keep an eye on you. My door is always open. If you need anyone to talk to, just let me know." Kuro just glared. As he had suspected, Dubois had spies everywhere, waiting for him to let some secret slip, waiting for him to feel safe, complacent, and trusting. Kuro then did his best to smile pleasantly at the teacher and said, "Thank you, sir, but I am fine," before making as hasty an exit as he could while hauling his backpack. By the end of the first day, Kuro's eyes were sore from reading, his brain ached from thinking, his hand was cramped from writing, and his backpack was so laden with textbooks that he could barely lift it. He already felt 2 days behind and couldn't imagine how he was going to actually pass any subjects. The only motivation he had was to stay out of Niflheim prison, but a quiet cell in the middle of the Arctic was starting to sound pretty compelling. None of the other children was having as much trouble as he was. Even Marie, who had never even heard of the veil a month ago, seemed to be better suited to wizardry than Kuro. All of them had an education of one kind or another. They had read more than the occasional discarded newspaper and had written longer compositions than "I owe you $4 and 1 toasted corned beef sandwich on French loaf." The next day saw the rest of his subjects for the term. French class was much like Elvish, utterly impenetrable. Marie, who spoke French better than English, said their version of French was weird and so old-fashioned that she could barely understand it. French was followed immediately by Gaelic, which would have been bad enough on its own, but Kuro's head was filled with bits of 2 other new languages already, competing for space. Nearly everyone else was glad of their next subject, music. They all thought it was easy, singing simple scales and well-known songs and doing familiar dances. Kuro was worse off than even the Fireflies. They didn't know the words, but they picked the melody well enough. Kuro's only exposure to music had been overhearing the occasional bawdy shanty being sung in a pub, and he'd never even seen someone dance. It didn't help that their teacher, Miss Ligia, kept telling them how critical their musical skill would be to their future success at the school. Social studies was a reprieve, not because the subject was easy, but because the teacher was hopeless. He was young enough that he could have been confused for one of the high school students if not for the ill-fitting tweed suit and crooked bow tie. He greeted the class with a stutter and looked so nervous that it made Kuro feel relaxed in comparison. The teacher wrote his name, Mr. Wittershins, by hand on the chalkboard, where the other teachers had written by magic. Once finished, he gave a shaky smile and then asked the class what would ultimately turn out to be a disastrous question. Let's see who's been working ahead, okay? He punched the air weakly. Who can tell me when the 3 kingdoms were founded? Evelyn, at the front of the class as she always was, extended her hand as though it were a flower blooming, and looked around to make certain she was the only one who knew the answer. Yes, please go ahead, said Mr. Wittershins. Le mieux. Evelyn introduced herself by last name as though the teacher should be impressed by it. Evelyn Le Mieux 10. The first kingdom was Alfheim, founded in 962 by wizards crossing the Bifrost ferry road from Vanaheim. The next settlers came across the ocean on Blandish boats from France and founded the Eastern Kingdom of Acadia in 1607. Finally, the wizards from the British Isles claimed the southern lands in 1670 as the Kingdom of Tiernanog. Oh, very good. Textbook answer. Mr. Wittershin applauded Evelyn and slowly wrote each name on the board. Now, could someone name the capital cities of each kingdom? Evelyn's hand raised again, but so did a few others, including Marie's. Mr. Wittershins took down the names of the capital. Saguenay, Ville-d'Is, New Camelot. But Marie's hand stayed up. Wittershins was surprised to find a hand raised, but he was quick to celebrate her bravery. Yes, a question, good, he said. Questions are very welcome in this class, where there are no bad questions. He gave a thumbs up to the class before nodding to Marie to speak. If there are only 3 kingdoms, why did the principal talk about 4 yesterday morning? Why are there 4 residences? Marie scanned the class quickly to see if she was asking a foolish question. Evelyn rolled her eyes at Marie's ignorance, but several others in class nodded along with curiosity. Mr. Wittershins tripped over himself. Yeah, very, very good, right, very good question. That's not really on the curriculum this year, but very good observation. He was visibly uncomfortable with the subject. So yes, there is another kingdom. The Western Wildlands technically belong to the Autumn Court, but nobody actually lives there. I do, shouted Charlie. Okay, right. Mr. Wittershins corrected himself. There are some brave settlers that have moved there, but the natives prefer to live outside the Vale. Do you mean like Native Americans? Asked Sean Cassidy without raising his hand. Do they have wizards? Why don't they come to Avalon? Well, that's complicated, said the flustered teacher. But very good questions. Very good. As I understand it, they prefer to live with their families, even those that cannot cross over. Family, I understand, is very important to them. Something in Wittershin's manner reminded Kuro of a thief in the market being questioned by a peacekeeper. He was choosing his words carefully and trying hard to make his interrogator stop asking questions. Also, yes, Autumn Lodge was built for them, Wittershins continued, but I assure you that they do not have any desire to use it anymore. They have made that very clear. Before anyone had a chance to ask anything further, he changed the subject. But, like I said, not on the curriculum this term. So let's instead open our new textbooks and read the chapter on the crossing of the Bifrost Bridge. Most of the class broke into chatter while vaguely pretending to read their text. Many scoffed at the idea of choosing to live in the Blandlands, saying they couldn't imagine how awful life would be without magic. Wittershins made no attempt to quiet them. He just sat shakily at his desk, looking like he'd escaped a werewolf. Marie, curious but afraid to look stupid, whispered more questions to Kuro and Charlie. All these places, Avalon, Dis, and Camelot, I've heard of them. Are they the ones from Blandlands stories? She was still getting used to calling her home the Blandlands and hesitated on the word. Kuro answered almost automatically. No, they're just stolen names, pale copies of the originals. He was surprised and uncomfortable to hear Phineas's words coming out of his mouth. Phineas had often spoken of the superiority and glory of the homeland across the ocean. Kuro had wondered why Phineas hadn't ever gone there if it was so much better, but he'd known better than to ask such things. Charlie rambled for the rest of the class about how great her home in the western wildlands was, how her farm had lots of interesting creatures. They specialized in breeding rare animals like wyverns and Cerberuses for rich wizards. She complained that it could be a bit lonely because there really weren't many people around. Humans, Arthur corrected, surprising the other three, as he appeared to be actually reading his textbook and had, until that point, not spoken a single word. What's that? Asked Charlie, excited to have someone else participating in her chatter. Arthur continued to keep his eyes forward and his nose buried in his book, but replied in a robotic monotone. There are people out there, just not many humans. He pulled the book closer to his face to show he had nothing more to say. The ringing of the bell distracted Charlie from probing further. The next class was Spellcraft, taught by Ms. Crawley. She was about as different from Wittershins as could be, mature, confident, and commanding. She wore large, round glasses and a neatly tailored gray morning coat, which together made her look an awful lot like the barn owl familiar perched on her shoulder. She quieted the class with no more than a clearing of her throat, a trick that Mr. Wittershins desperately needed to learn. In this class, we will be learning the basics of spellcraft. That includes everything from runic theory to wand and staff work, with a strong focus on linguistic evocation, otherwise known as spells with words. She spoke crisply, deliberately enunciating each word clearly as if dictating a letter, but also with a slight smile. Before you ask, we shall not be learning to summon familiars. A hand shot up in the front row, and without even having to look to the student, Ms. Crawley answered, There is a full course on summoning next year. You will learn then. The first hand withdrew slowly, but another rose quickly to fill its place. Again, Ms. Crawley answered without the question even being asked. For two very good reasons, she said. The first is that few of you will have adequate mastery of Gaelic or dance to incant the spell until next year. The second and more important reason is that people put entirely too much stock in the shape of familiars. There's always someone who ends up with a Pegasus or some such, and everyone thinks it means something. Far better for you to learn who each other is without familiars complicating it. The hand with the question fell, and the class collectively sighed in disappointment, but Ms. Crawley did not let them wallow in it. Can anyone tell me how I knew what your questions were going to be? The hand of a Summerhill girl raised hesitantly. Yes, Abigail, go ahead, the teacher said without having to turn to see her. Abigail stood and said, Telepathy? Yes, very good. It is the first and most practiced technique in the field of mentalism. A piece of chalk began to move on its own and write the word across the board. Can you tell me what it is used for? It's talking and listening to thoughts. Abigail appeared excited about the subject and bounced a little as she explained. Well done. Ms. Crawley nodded crisply and gave an encouraging smile to Abigail before explaining more to the class. I could hear the questions you were planning to ask. You were practically screaming them in your mind. Can anyone name another mentalist magic? Yes, I foresee that Geneviève will be able to name one of the two remaining ones. Geneviève looked shocked for a moment that she'd been called on, but pieced together Ms. Crawley's clue. Clairvoyance, she said. Seeing things that are far away in the future. Very good. There's only one left, and someone knows the answer, but they're too shy to put up their hand. It's okay, you can tell us, Kuro. Kuro choked when he was called on. He did know the answer. It had been ringing in his mind since the teacher had asked. It was one form of magic that Kuro had extensive experience with, and he had been on the receiving end of it regularly. Kuro had no intention of answering, but he must have been thinking it loudly enough that Ms. Crawley had heard him. Kuro stood and cleared his throat. He felt a little shaky with so many eyes on him, but he tried his best not to let his voice waver. Neuromancy. It's controlling other people's minds, was all that he said out loud. But running through his head was a much longer explanation. It can make you feel every bad feeling there is, like all of your skin is being burned and sand is being ground into your eyes while every bone in your body breaks. And you want to scream, but it's like you're drowning and you can't breathe at all, or make you do things you don't want to, or make you want to do things you would never do. His thoughts had been much too loud. Ms. Crawley had a look of horror on her face. She found her voice after a few too many moments, and pasted on a congratulatory smile as she had with the other students. That is absolutely correct, and that is why neuromancy is tightly regulated. We won't be doing any of it here at Avalon, so you don't have to worry about that. She said the last while looking directly at Kuro. Instead, we'll be working a lot on how to protect yourself from magic, your own and others. We'll start with how to keep those thoughts more private and your mind to yourself. She continued the lesson as if all were normal, but sadness crept into her normally aggressive eyes whenever she looked at Kuro. At the end of class, Ms. Crawley asked him to stay behind. Kuro, she said sympathetically, I'm very sorry. I heard your thoughts. It was impolite of me to be listening. It sounded to me like you knew that kind of neuromancy felt like yourself. Is that true? Yeah, he answered hesitantly, worrying that he was somehow in trouble, but seeing no way to deny what she already knew. It's okay. Her stern features had melted away and she looked sad and caring. I just want to know the person who cast it. Do you know who they are? Kuro was getting suspicious. Yes, he said again, uncertain if it was the right answer. Do you know where they are? She asked. Kuro chose both his thoughts and words carefully. He didn't want to give away any information about his master, but he was pretty sure he knew what she wanted to hear regardless of whether it was true. Niflheim Prison, he replied. Ms. Crawley visibly relaxed at the answer. Have you talked to anyone about your experience? She said awkwardly. No. Kuro couldn't imagine anyone caring to know. It can help, she said, putting her hand on his shoulder. Believe me. Can you keep a secret? If Kuro was good at anything, it was keeping secrets. He nodded. She paused and took a moment to swallow and steady her breathing. I've had some similar experiences. Having someone to talk to afterwards really helped. If you ever need someone, you could tell me, okay? Another spy. She was trying to trade a secret for a secret, but he wasn't going to fall for it. Kuro faked a smile and thanked her before running off to alchemy. Alchemy should have been Kuro's best subject. He had helped Phineas through enough concoctions and cooked enough meals that he knew how to follow a recipe. Unfortunately, he quickly discovered that skill had very little to do with success in the class. Most of the students from the other residences came with brand new sets of equipment. They had clean beakers, accurate scales, sharp knives, and sturdy granite mortars and pestles. Most of the lodgers were stuck using worn, chipped, and stained sets that were provided by the school, which had been used by generations of students before them. The alchemy teacher was Professeur de Rigueur. He was an old man with thin and bony fingers and drooping features, though he carried himself like a spring prince, haughty, melancholic, and detached. He wore a gaudy wig of white curls and powdered his face heavily to hide his wrinkles. He spent most of the class reclining on a velvet chaise lounge he had in the classroom, draped in a silk smoking jacket, feeding himself grapes and dozing while students were busy with their work. That he demanded the students refer to him as Professeur rather than by name told Kuro more than enough about him. Kuro knew the type. Most nobles wouldn't bother coming down to Bytown Market. They'd send servants. Men like de Rigueur, though, they'd come just to show off their possessions. They'd spread stories and dangle the promise of money, but they carried little and clutched it tightly. They never gave to beggars. To men like de Rigueur, Kuro had always been invisible. Actual accomplishment in the class seemed irrelevant. De Rigueur was much more interested in pedigree than performance, which he made extremely clear on the first day. Before class had even started, he congratulated the students with their own supplies on their commitment to their education. As he called the names on the roster for attendance, he stopped to quiz students if he found a name familiar. He had passed casually through most of the list before his eyes brightened and he called on Avalon Lemieux. Présent, Evelyn replied as though all in attendance should celebrate the fact. Isn't your father the great nephew of the Winter King? De Rigueur smiled broadly at her from behind droopy eyelids. Yes, she replied haughtily. Father is his 17th in line for the Winter Throne, and mother is second cousin to the Spring Queen. Very good. Professor de Rigueur smiled broadly at Evelyn, looking her over as if she were a prize he had won. Very good indeed. He noted a couple other students on their somewhat less impressive breeding. The only ones from Autumn Lodge worth pausing on appeared to be at the very end of the list. Also Wood. De Rigueur's eyes opened near enough to see his pupils. I know your father. How is he doing in his new position? He gave Arthur a knowing wink. Well, sir, thank you, sir, he replied politely, not lifting his eyes from his shoes. Arthur was somewhat less prideful than Evelyn and looked ready to run from the class before it had even begun. Extra attention was apparently not something Arthur was angling for. De Rigueur gave Arthur an unwelcome pat on the shoulder and moved on to the last name on the list. He paused on it for a moment before deciding to interrogate Kuro on it. Kuro, a Japanese name, isn't it? It means black, I believe. I speak a little Japanese from my time as ambassador to Takamagahara. He paused so the room had time to be appropriately impressed. The professeur was incorrect. Kuro's name did not mean black. It was a number from some other language. Phineas had told him. It meant that he was number 9. Your family name is missing on the roster. Can I fill it in? His eyebrows raised with inquisitive curiosity, but his skin was too loose for the effect to reach the rest of his face. Kuro contemplated lying to de Rigueur. This was his chance to give himself a name and a family. He even thought for a moment about saying Dubois just to upstage Evelyn. But de Rigueur was so enamored with the rich or famous students and so boastful of his own prestige that Kuro couldn't stand the idea of pandering to him. I don't have one, Kuro said flatly. Oh, that is unusual. I was once in Africa on safari in my youth, hunting ropen, and some of the wizards there don't have last names either. They say it protects them from certain dark magics. De Rigueur looked around the room to confirm that everyone was adequately interested in his story before turning back to Kuro. Where are your parents from? Don't have any, scowled Kuro. That effectively killed Kuro in de Rigueur's droopy eyes, though he tried one more angle. An orphan, eh? Well done then, making it to Avalon. Are you here on scholarship? I'm here on parole, Kuro glared, and de Rigueur choked on his next words before they emerged. It was a stupid thing to say. He had just exposed himself as a criminal to his new friends. He'd probably have to lie to smooth it over, but he couldn't help enjoying de Rigueur's distressed expression. That first class involved creating a salve for burns. As they powdered their weevil proboscises and stewed salamander toenails, Charlie scooted her stool closer to Kuro so she could talk to him privately. She looked as though she might explode if she didn't ask him about what he'd said. "Is it true? Are you really here on parole? What did you do? Why didn't you tell me before?" she whispered. He didn't like lying to Charlie. She trusted him implicitly despite his having done nothing to earn it. Misleading her made him really uncomfortable. "Well, Kuro stammered. "It's not exactly true. I mostly just said it because he was fussing over the rich kids with fancy names." "Was he?" Charlie was surprised by the accusation. "I didn't notice that. I kinda like him. He's weird and he has a cool wig." Arthur, who was sitting on the other side of Kuro, had overheard them and agreed with Kuro. "I was warned about him," he mumbled. "He likes powerful people to owe him favors." After 2 days of sharing a class, residence, and room with Arthur, this was the most Kuro had heard him speak. Arthur spoke only in single words most of the time, and he seemed always to be concentrating on something. At the moment, it should have been his pot of salamander parts as it was boiling over. De rigueur appeared far more quickly than seemed possible for such a rickety old man. With a dash of beaver hairs and a stir of the pot, he had set it right. "There you are, young Miss Wood. Keep at it. You're doing well." He gave a conspiratorial smile and then hobbled off to pay an excess of compliments to Evelyn. The salve was a simple brew, and Kuro was near the first to finish, despite the shoddy equipment. He had a beaker of his sweet-smelling ointment sitting on display waiting evaluation well before the class ended. De rigueur passed him several times as though he weren't even there. The withered teacher, however, noticed Evelyn's brew the moment it was complete. "Well done, Miss Lemieux. Well done indeed. Everyone have a look at this." De rigueur was falling over himself to compliment her work, and Evelyn was basking in the praise. He held up a spoon of her goop to show the class. He moved throughout the class, evaluating the color, texture, and aroma of each paste. When he came to the bench where Kuro, Charlie, and Arthur were sitting, he swept Kuro's beaker off the desk and marveled at it. "Fantastique, just fantastique. Top marks, look at the clarity, observe the creaminess. I dare say I've not seen such an excellent burnt salve in years." Kuro noticed that Evelyn was furious someone in the class was receiving higher praise than she had. Kuro smiled smugly at her. His gloating was cut short, however, as de rigueur continued. "Well done, Mr. Wood." Kuro's heart sank. Arthur flushed and tried to correct the teacher, but he seemed unable to say anything at all. He just kept staring at the beaker and opening and closing his mouth. Charlie was so furious at the injustice of it that she appeared to forget how to sit up properly and fell off her chair. De rigueur pretended to notice none of this. He just gave a congratulatory pat on the back to Arthur and moved away. Arthur looked utterly abashed. "I'm sorry, Kuro, I didn't mean to. You deserve the credit, not me." "It's all right, Arthur," Kuro said resignedly. Kuro wasn't overly bothered by being overlooked. He had a strong feeling that de rigueur was one teacher who wouldn't try to keep him after class. "Besides," he continued, "I feel I got something better than good grades." Kuro looked back to Evelyn, who was still fuming. Kuro even thought that he saw one of her perfect curls fall out of place. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.